Welcome back to Destigmatized Mental Health Podcast, Hope in the Valley series. I'm your host, Ramon Sanchez, alongside my co-host, Dr. Ashley Herrera. We want to explore what it takes to break stigmas and rebuild hope in our communities. Again, Dr. Ashley Herrera is a licensed clinical social worker, researcher, and founder of Hope in the Valley. Her focus is to expand practical life-saving resources and improve health equity for people impacted by opioid and stimulant use here in Kern County. Each episode, we're going to go ahead and sit down with people that are working in the front lines, doctors, researchers, and community members to talk honestly about what's working, what's not working, and how we can support the health and well-being of our community. Today, we're focusing on the Native American community, and we've invited two vital members of the Bakersfield American Indian Health Project. My first guest is Johnny Delgado. Johnny is a grant program director at BAIHP, born and raised here in Bakersfield and motivated by his family's Paiute heritage. Johnny supports the culturally grounded health system that strengthens tradition and promotes wellness for American Indian and Alaska Native communities in Kern County. My next guest is Cheyenne Bond, a KDAC 2 and the Enhanced Care Management Lead at BAIHP. Cheyenne is a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. She's currently pursuing her bachelor's in behavioral science with an emphasis in trauma, and since 2019, she's been a fierce advocate for those struggling with addiction through a co-occurring lens. Together, we're digging into the intersections of tradition, systemic challenges, and the path to healing. And now, here's our episode. Destigmatized Mental Health Podcast, Hope in the Valley series, episode 4. We are back with my awesome co-host, Dr. Ashley Herrera. And then we also have Johnny and Cheyenne as we discuss on our intros. Everyone, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. So what we're going to go ahead and talk about today, it's how medication-assisted treatment, the Native American community, as you guys both work for the
Bakersfield American Indian Health Project. Yes, we both do.
We call it BAIHP for short.
Before we even get into the heavy and necessary topic, where can our listeners find you both and the Bakersfield American Indian Health Project?
We're located at 501 40th Street. For those living in Bakersfield, we're right behind Memorial Hospital off of San Dimas and 40th.
Awesome. Any websites or Instagram that you want to go ahead and plug in?
The website is bakersfieldaihp.org.
I believe the Instagram is just BAIHP, I believe.
And I'll definitely go ahead and plug that in as well as we're doing our episode.
And guys, what about your rural clinic?
I was going to talk about that too. We also do have one up now in Lake Isabella, and that is on Mountain Mesa Drive, right next to a church. I believe the address is 12308 Mountain Mesa Drive. It's open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And we have some staff up there as well now, too. That's still relatively new.
Yeah, the address shows Lake Isabella, but for those living out there in the Kern River Valley, they'll know it as Mount Mesa area.
Okay, perfect. So how does everyone know each other here? I know that Dr. Herrera knows everyone and their moms, but how does everyone know each other here?
So we're coalition members. We're part of the Project Hope Coalition. We work together to address opioid overdose in our community and develop culturally informed strategies for prevention and to help folks navigate and access treatment. And we've partnered on some wellness vending machines and just met Johnny and thought he was such an incredible champion for the community and so much passion and energy for continuing to grow access to substance use disorder and mental health treatment for the community, and making sure that Native folks here have what they need in a way that they need it. And they do some of the coolest evidence-based practices I've ever seen, like their bingo, not related to this project, but getting the elders up and moving, trying to address diabetes in their community. So just seeing so many outstanding evidence-based approaches that are centering culture and really engaging people made me excited to get to know them more and see what kind of good work we could do together.
Awesome. And how long has the Bakersfield American Indian Health Project been part of Project Hope?
That's a good question. I want to say 4 years, has it been? I met his name is John. He works for Aegis, and he was talking to us about the vending machines and had funding to purchase one and help us sponsor one. And he introduced me to Dr. Herrera, and he said she has a monopoly in Kern County. You want to work with her. And he brought her in and for, a meet and greet, and we hit it off. And I think the three of us have done some work together as well, though, and it's been very successful. So it's been a great relationship ever since.
I started in the summer of 2023, starting as a substance abuse counselor. Then I moved into a program supervisor role. And then just last week, I accepted a new one for cultural coordinator. So I'll be able to do, surprise, a lot more stuff with you guys now. Yeah.
How cool.
A lot less strict, so I'll be able to do a lot more of the cultural stuff, more of back on the substance abuse stuff. Very excited about that. So this will be my 3rd year.
Awesome. Congratulations on that.
Thanks.
I do want to go ahead and start off with talking about cultural context and stigma that comes associated with, with just everything that has to do with opioid use disorder and stimulant use disorder. So to start off, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you see regarding opioid and stimulant use, specifically within the Native American community here in the Central Valley?
Off the top of my head, I think that it's more you know that there is an alcohol issue among Native Americans. And so I feel like that is what a lot of people focus on is reduction in alcoholism, lowering drinking. But there is a huge issue with opiates and stimulants out there. What I've seen among my clients is that once they've stopped stimulants or, opiates, then they're like, well, okay, well, now I can drink. And, that was never my main issue or, vice versa. But it is such a big issue. And culture does play a big part of recovery. But there is still the stigma that, I'm going to do this on my own. And maybe that is more of the westernized take of it, where it's I just need to work on this myself. But having worked for, past companies that are more of the westernized way of healing versus, incorporating culture, and they get some things right, but you've got to incorporate your own culture into it. And, just realizing that stimulant use, opiate use isn't just for a lack of a better phrase, a white people issue. It's everyone. Everything that different communities use, it does affect other populations. And it's just as dangerous. When you think of how isolated reservations get and how, they try to do things on their own, it's dangerous, And then you consider how, when we think of the MMIP crisis, people get overlooked when they pass, when they overdose. So I'd say it's an everyone problem, not just one population or one community. It's an everyone issue, honestly.
It was really surprising. We were putting together a grant application over the holidays, and this was focused on a community that's in a reservation for Montana. So I was doing a lot of research in general, focused on overdose deaths, and I learned that Native communities have the highest rate of methamphetamine-involved overdoses out of any population. And it's surprising to hear you say that there's been so much focus on alcohol when there's this really significant driver that's leading to preventable deaths in the Native community. And I'm just wondering, what kind of messaging is out there? Are people talking about methamphetamine and the risk and prevention? How are these conversations coming up? And if they are or if they aren't, how could they be more culturally grounded to engage folks better in this discussion?
When you say that, I think I'm thinking back to all my clients that I've worked with. A lot of them, their stories would kind of be along the lines of, oh, I did meth in the 90s. I did meth in the early 2000s. Kind of it's not a big issue now, but, having been in the addiction world for 5 years or so, it is still such an issue, especially in Kern County that I've seen. Because, when you think about it, it is a cheaper substance that you can buy. So I've seen, some of my clients that are this, has been a non-issue for, 20, 30 years for me. But then, something happens, they go out and relapse. They try to buy something, that they know before didn't really hurt them. And then it's totally different because there's so much disgusting stuff in it. Fentanyl, honestly, God knows what. I've had drug tests that have come back positive for PCP, it's just crazy. And so, yeah. And then, you kind of start seeing people drop like flies, you know. I don't know, maybe it's people think that it's a safer drug to use, maybe, because maybe it was back in the 90s, early 2000s, but
Now it's like very nonchalant that a lot, like it was very nonchalant that back in the 90s they used to use it, and now, and it's okay. But things have gotten worse in a lot of ways when it comes down to substance use.
I would say that's definitely a factor in there, just because it's the thought process where I've done it before. It's no big deal. It's whatever. Of course, drugs are getting stronger every day, and there's a lack of knowledge in general, especially like the introduction of fentanyl into the community. I would also say though is that one of the biggest factors, misconceptions, or in general what happens in the communities themselves is they don't talk about it. A lot of the communities don't talk about it. It's kind of taboo to talk about somebody's health. And there's a lot of fear associated with seeking services in general for those using substances in Native communities because of the way the community is going to look at them. If I'm on a reservation, as Shannon was stating, and you're using substances, if people find out, people are going to shun you, people are going to talk about you, they may talk about your family as well and look at you in a negative light. So a lot of I can't say a lot of clients, I would say some of our clients that we have are from other tribal communities that don't go to their own healthcare center to seek services because they're afraid of the stigma associated with it. They're afraid of people in the community talking about them. And those community members are family members. Family is supposed to be a support to help you in your community. They're support you with your prevention, support you to wellness in the community. And when you don't have that, when you're trying to get well, what do you really have? And I think that's a struggle for a lot of natives, is that they don't have that community base. And a lot of that is associated with the generational historical trauma in terms of the, negative health outcomes in general for the community. They, suffered over many, many years. And so the resiliency factors that the community had that was once there, which culture being a basis of it, isn't there to support them anymore. And so when you don't have these things to support you, what do you really have to get well? Evidence shows, faith-based recovery is, a big factor in people getting well and looking to that higher power. As an organization, we try to promote wellness in general in the community to instill those resiliency factors in the community so that they have them to either avoid or to get well when they're ready to seek wellness.
You mentioned one thing that's really, and again, I could only speak on my Latino culture. You mentioned the names. Last names are a huge deal in our culture. Is that similar in the Native American culture?
Yes. If you say a last name in that community, they know your family tree. My wife, whenever she meets somebody from her tribe, they always say, "Well, what's their name?" So, who is her grandmother is what they usually ask. Who is her mom? Who is her grandmother? Who is her great grandma? They always link the family tree and figure out how they're related somehow. And it's just by the name. So, like, oh yeah, I know that name, or I know that name. And it's a funny story is that's how my wife ended up finding out what tribe she was associated, was just by the last names being shared. Where I was talking to actually one of our board members, and she's like, "That name sounds familiar." And then she had her husband text her the family picture of the family tree that he had, and they found out they were cousins. And like, "Hey, this is your grandmother here, your great grandmother, and it looks like she had kids, and then your grandma's brother or aunt or sister is one of them, was their grandmother." And so it was just kind of bizarre, it wasn't a bizarre, but it was kind of just random that it occurred. I wasn't even talking with them, I was talking to somebody else about it. They easily link like that.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you guys think that because of the centuries of oppression, right, in the United States and what has happened to Native communities and how they were essentially policed, surveilled, and systematically destroyed, do you think there's a pressure within the community to seem like we don't have problems and that these types of things are not happening here because of as a way to protect themselves from continued harm, right? For, being over policed or being labeled, being discriminated against. There's this idea that we can't afford to have problems.
I would say a lot of it is that the community wasn't prepared to deal with substance use in general. When you look back, when substances occurred, substances was, brought in from the West. Native Americans, it's not something that really, if it was around, I'm not aware of it though, but I would say it probably wasn't as predominant as it was. You had community there, you had community and culture there to help you get well and help you stay, on track to live well. Whereas when you look back to when those exposures came, the number one thing was alcoholism. They weren't just alcoholism, they were paid with alcohol. It was illegal for natives to work, but it was illegal not to work. Native Americans didn't have rights for a long period of time, and they couldn't even practice their culture until, the late 1900s. So when you take those into account. The community itself wasn't prepared to deal with the exposure that occurred to them. So if you don't know how to deal with it, what do? So I feel, and I can't say definitely, this is the case though, but I feel more so it's not talk about it because the community didn't know how to deal with it. Don't talk about it and the problem will solve itself. The talk will go away. And I see that apparent, and to me, I relate to it because that's how my grandmother was. She wouldn't talk about my aunts and uncles using substances. She would act like nothing happened. She would just go away from it, avoid the conversation, wouldn't talk about it. And my thought is like you're enabling for one though, but you're also avoiding the situation in general because you don't know how to deal with it. And so that's how I feel is more so with the community than anything. And it's just the lack of having that knowledge of how to deal with it for one, the lack of awareness as well on how substances work, because a lot of natives don't really understand how substances, cause the harm that they do. And so you have that, and then it produces, of course, stigma as well, though, in the community is drawn from that too, though. And then you also have, and this happens, and this is very sad that it happens as well, though. You were talking about the community in Montana. There was a community out in that area of the country. I'm not going to say where exactly. I was at a grantee symposium, and one of the grantees were talking that their community doesn't want to deal with opioids because of who that person is in the community is selling those substances. They're related to a tribal chair, one of the tribal members. So when you look at the board members of the tribe, sometimes it's just you can't talk about those people because of their position within the tribe and their authority there. And therefore, there isn't a problem, because if there is a problem, then it's going to make that person look bad. Because when you look at the family names, if one person in the community isn't living well, it reflects on the family in general, which is unfortunate though. And it's not a very healthy way for the community to address substances, the stigma. And because if you don't talk about it, then nothing's going to be done about it. And so I think that's one of the thinking back on that community specific itself and what was shared was just that they didn't want to talk about it because of who people were, and they don't want the family to look bad.
I think there is something to also be said about having been oppressed and policed for so long as well, because there is a level of distrust for government entities because, you have to consider like when we were colonized, and I'm part of the Choctaw tribe. So I was my family is part of the Trail of Tears, and, having to be assimilated and all that. You get nervous to share this information because you're like, what are they going to do with this information? How are they going to use this information against me to take down my family, to use against me? So there is in conjunction with what Johnny said, there is also distrust of, I don't want to go to this strange, we'll say rehab for lack of a better phrase, because these people, I don't know what they're going to do with this information. I don't know if I can trust them. I don't know if the MAT medication that they're suggesting is going to be, is going to turn into something like forced sterilization, like that's happened to a lot of Native women. We don't know what's going to happen. So instead, I'm going to be more comfortable and ignore my problem, and I'm going to just see what happens, ignore it until it goes away, something like that. So I feel like there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to Native Americans not getting treatment.
You're right. And thinking about it as well, though, I would think it's culturally appropriate treatment as well, though. I don't know how many people I've spoken with in the community and other Native communities as well that have gone through recovery and really felt that the recovery program that they went through really didn't meet their needs. And they struggled with it, though, because culture is a big thing. Whereas you're having to explain these programs sometimes your culture and telling them why you practice certain things. And it's very personal. Culture is very personal. It's like, why do I smudge? What is sweat for? When a family member dies, what is a cry? And you're having to be vulnerable and express to other people what you're going through in that moment. Whereas just dealing with the situation is a struggle within itself, though. And so even though people may be sympathetic, people may be understanding and try to work with you on it, and you're in a program, let's say, you got to explain why you have these practices and why you're wanting to do certain things or why you need to go through certain things in terms of culture, it really makes yourself feel very vulnerable and exposed. And then when you're already going through recovery as well, to some extent, when you're explaining these things, you feel judged.
Mm-hmm.
because they're basically judging what you're telling them. I need a sweat because it's going to cleanse me, because it's going to heal me, though. I need a sweat because it's going to, purify me. It's medicine. And you're telling somebody that, and you're waiting for them to make a decision, on whether or not they're going to allow you to practice it. It's very, very personal, and it could be very hurtful to some extent, especially if your request gets denied.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that kind of goes into my next question. I'm curious about the invisible side of this. What does the stigma look like in the community, and how do people successfully break through that shame to ask for help, if that even happens?
I feel like the judgment is probably like the biggest part of the stigma. I've had a lot of clients where Johnny and I work that have been like, oh, like, mind you, like I'm a substance abuse counselor. I'm never telling, anyone whatever like a client's told me, right? But even at our organization, we do have like a lot of families that go there and they'll go to things together. I've had clients that have tried to schedule times with me when they know like their aunt or their grandma's not going to be there, because obviously if someone goes there and they're meeting with me individually, you can come to that conclusion, well, they're getting substance abuse treatment, or, they're in some kind of addiction recovery. So you can,
Fill in the blanks in a
yes,
sense.
essentially. And I would work with them, and I'm like, okay. I was like, I know that they're going to be at this group from this time to this time. So why don't you come in like an hour later, just in case they decide to hang out? Or let's do telehealth, like, so they don't even need to know that I'm around. There is a lot of judgment and there is a lot of shame. And maybe that's not even like a cultural thing, because I know that happens in all kinds of families, but there is like to extent like for, example, like my nephew is addicted to opiates. So me as an aunt, I'm going to feel shame for our family because it's a shameful thing. So there is a lot of that. There is, when I think back to my clients, there's a lot of isolation, a lot of just disappearing. If I don't hear from a couple of them for a couple weeks at a time, I know like I'm going to send like one of our like community healthcare workers out there to do a home visit just in case, to make sure they're okay, because they will isolate. Or typically what I'll try to do ahead of time is to get some kind of release of information for like a partner, someone that they do trust, to be like, okay, I can't get a hold of so and so, so let me try their wife, because I know they're probably in like a shame spiral, and, they're going to try and dodge my calls, something along those lines. So that's one of the biggest ones I can think of. I have also seen it kind of like that, the stigma morph into something that would fall like more under like self-harm. Just, like the overwhelming sense of shame kind of grows into, burning, cutting, things like that, because like they really like don't want to talk about it. And then it can cut into like their spiritual practices. Like I've had multiple like gentlemen I've worked with that are like, I haven't gone to drumming in like 6 months because I know like my spirit's not right and I don't want to bring bad medicine to the drum and the other, people that I'm around. And so then that like interferes with their cultural practice. And then obviously it's like all downhill from there, So it can get really, really, really heavy.
Yeah, makes sense. Drum circles are huge cultural practice within the Native American community. I know that I got to meet some of the indigenous members when I went to an annual circle that Círculo that Amayetza Yudiwali has every single year, and I got to meet some members, and I knew I messed up. And I'll tell you my story. My story was that I went in and I was introducing myself and just my culture. And the first thing that they asked me was, who are my grandparents? And it was a really interesting, just dialogue. But more importantly, one of the things that I did where I 100% messed up was I said, hey, if you guys ever need anything, and I gave them my business card. I messed up. I messed up right there. And it was like, we have our own. And I was like, okay, that was good enough for me. And I guess walk me down. Where did I mess up? I know where I messed up, but for our listeners and our viewers, where did I mess up?
Honestly, if you met them for the first time, then who are you?
Exactly.
Why are you here? Why is a head doctor here trying to get us in? What do you want from us? So I think it's a more of a perception of looking for self-gain than anything else. Trust is one of the main factors in the community. And if they don't know you, they're not going to trust you, though. And the community talks in general as well, though. When you speak to, essentially, and I tell new hires and I tell my staff, though, is that whenever you meet one Native in the community at the clinic, everybody else is going to know who you are. You're going to be at an event and people are just going to talk to you randomly and know exactly who you are and what you do because they communicate more so behind the scenes. And so coming in to the Native community, if you're really there to support, you come in, you don't talk, you listen. If they talk to you, yes, you talk, but you don't throw yourself out there. And it's very different in the community. And even a handshake can be a big difference. In Western culture and even Latino culture, you always want a good, firm, strong handshake. Not overly hard because then you're trying to be intimidating, not too weak because then you look as soft and really weak in general. Native communities aren't like that. It's more of a softer handshake more than anything else, though, because when you're having a firm handshake, you are coming across as aggressive. Why are you being aggressive to me? And so it's really looked at. It really comes from a place of being humble than anything else, though. And even in some communities as well, especially when it comes to like tribal councils, is you don't talk at all. You come in, if you're invited, you sit and you listen. You don't talk unless you're talked to. And that's just how the communities work in general, where you have to come into it in a good way, but also in a humble as well.
Trust me, I definitely got humbled right then and there. But the wonderful, gracious thing about even my mistake in that moment was that they invited me back to their circle. And that was so beautiful to me to be able to say, hey, you messed up and we know that you didn't mean it that way. However, we will invite you back so you could continue to earn our trust. And I'm going to go ahead and say it and make a safe assumption that is how, maybe not the circle, but maybe that is how Dr. Herrera earned the trust of the Native American community here in Bakersfield. Because for you two to be doing this episode, this is huge. Is that a safe assumption to say?
That's a safe assumption, but it goes beyond that, though. For one, it's being honest, being helpful, being willing to support, and being transparent with no intention of self-gain. And that's the biggest thing is you're doing it to be selfless to some extent, though, because even beyond looking at a relationship with the wellness vending machines, though, whenever anything's needed and I say, hey, we have this event, do you mind showing up and distributing Narcan and at the event, and you bring your CPR dummy to kind of show them how to administer the Narcan as well. And which has been a great success, though, because some people just don't know how to deliver it. And it's working from that respect there too, that built things out. And then also too, being humble in the approach in general as well. When we have these cards that go inside of the items that are distributed to the wellness vending machine, and they had the materials in there, they sent it to us, and what we did is we indigenize it. It's just being open to that. It's just being open to that dialogue and into that feedback, being willing to learn about the culture and not assuming anything in advance, not assuming you fully understand the community being served. Regardless of your credential, regardless of your understanding of substance uses in general, and the effects they have, it's been able to look at the community factors in general and how the community deals with it.
Sure. Any encounters that you have had, Dr. Herrera, with the indigenous community here in Kern County that, especially as it relates towards the research and the work that you're doing, that is assisting everyone, not just the Native American community?
So I think what's been really powerful is that we've been learning together about how do you launch this novel intervention in our community. And like Johnny was saying, it was starting all the way at the beginning as partners in developing it together. So they took over the design elements, right? They know what are people going to be interested in seeing, is going to draw them in, is messaging that's going to be accessible and acceptable. And they should be in charge of that, right? Because they have ownership of that program. And they designed a really beautiful machine. And if anyone wants to go see it, it is at 40th Street, open for viewing. And they have a second one that's going to be in their Kern River Valley Clinic, and they updated the design for that one as well. And they're really beautiful. And I love to show them off, whenever we're showing our work, across the United States for what's possible when you are centering, Native voices in the design of an intervention. And then all the way down to the cards. And they were very active, engaged partners on all these levels. And then understanding, okay, we said, here's all the possible things you could put in this machine for overdose prevention, health promotion, infectious disease prevention. And they took it to the tribal elders, right? Because that needed the sign off as a key part of, is this going to be approved or not? Because we could have every great idea. And if we don't get the buy-in from the community, it's not going to happen. And when he came back and said they said yes to everything. So they have one of the most progressive, robust machines in the United States, period, full stop, was incredible, especially hearing that, in some communities, Native communities, there's so much stigma and shame. We don't want to talk about the problem. We don't know how to address it. We don't know what resources we should even be offering to people. And they took this incredible chance to say, let's use evidence-based approaches to provide as much as possible to our community so that there are resources for wellness and healing. That was a really powerful message. And I think one of the coolest moments was when we did the unveiling of the machine and the ribbon cutting, and then tribal elders were there, and the gentleman came up to me, and we were talking about naloxone, and I was playing with the CPR dummy, and he told me this is good medicine. And so to get that type of endorsement that overdose prevention is here to stay, that they understand it, that they think it's important, and that they trust this after, Cheyenne saying there's so much mistrust, there's been so much historical harm, to a point where even like Johnny's told me in the past when we're touring their health center that they're like, people don't want to sign up for Medi-Cal because they don't trust the government. And so luckily we're able to cover them, through a different mechanism for insurance, but people don't want their information given out that way. So to say, yes, we'll put this machine here. Yes, we'll have all these resources. And we are so open, right, to these approaches that not everybody's on board with. And I thought that was really exciting. And then as we learn more about programs across the country and what other Native communities were doing, Johnny said in our next machine, we're going to put sponge kits. And so that folks don't have to go out and collect their own medicine. The medicine's already ready for them to use. So there isn't one of these barriers to spiritual practices because folks think that they're in a bad place with their spirits already ready for them to be able to use and re-engage with culture as wellness.
Building on that and being able to go ahead and just kind of highlighting what Cheyenne was talking about, we can't talk about today without talking about the past. With that said, how does intergenerational trauma and systemic marginalization continue to shape the substance use challenges that we see in our community right now?
I feel like that's a loaded question because it's, when you think about it, it makes up everything, right? Like what happened with my family being, colonized, back in the day, and relocation during the Trail of Tears. And, like my our tribe is from Oklahoma, and we're kind of spread out all over Oklahoma. I have some family that's in Texas that I've never met. And then I was born in Kern County. So I've been here my whole life. But I think it was like last year, I was asking my aunt who's Native, just like, how did we end up here? Because someone asked me in passing, like, oh, like, why are you not in Oklahoma? And I was like, that's a really good question. Like, 'cause I don't know, right? My dad, who's my Native parent, my mom's white. My dad was kind of private about everything. We were raised very Christian. We were raised very no, traditional spiritual practices. And so I asked my aunt, I was like, how did we end up here? Because I know my dad's birth certificate says Oklahoma, yours says Texas. So what happened? And she had told me it was because their mom was fleeing CPS because she had schizophrenia. And she, had family here. And that's how our whole family ended up here. And I was like, I had no idea. And I was like, why did I not know that? And she was like, well, we had a really bad childhood. We just had a really bad childhood. We didn't talk about it, and I feel like that's just a good example. It's you have these family secrets and they get passed down, and you just some people just don't know that that's what they're dealing with, And then for schizophrenia, for example, and I'm sure you guys are aware, certain drugs can trigger early stages of schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. So when I think about what if I had been a teenager and I was experimenting with hallucinogens, what if I, had that pre-existing and that just triggered it, you know what I mean? But I didn't know, so I couldn't empower myself to be careful, it just, trickles all the way down. So I feel like it's something it's really important to be transparent, with your children, for example, right? Luckily, because my dad has had a history of substance abuse, he was very transparent with us about don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, right? Instead of hiding it, luckily. But we've been talking about, sometimes it is just kind of a secret and you don't share that with people. And So when you have the knowledge of what your history looks like, you can make better informed decisions for yourself as you grow. And you know, like, okay, like I know I have like a history of addiction in my family. I know I have a history of like severe mental illness in my family. So let me try to make the best choices I can. And sometimes sometimes people don't go that route. They're kind of like, I know I've met people that are like, this is like what I'm destined to be. So I can't fight it. I'm not going to do anything about it. And it happens, when you kind of have more of like an apathetic approach, and that's fine. It's just needing to know that this is what we're kind of up against. So we have the option to make better decisions. But I feel like it still controls a lot of things. Like, even though like I'm aware more so of my family history now, it's still like in my conscience, like, okay, like let me make a better decision because of X, Y, and Z. So I feel like it can be hard to get out of that. You feel like that's like what you're destined to wind up as.
Johnny, any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah.
You're like, oh yeah.
Well, a lot of things come to mind while Shannon was speaking. One of the big things we hear as well, working at BAIHP, is that people that are newly introduced to the community and just finding out that they're Native American in general. It happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I have a staff member that just found out they were Native after they turned 18, graduated from high school, found out they were Native just in conversation, and they look to their dad like, why are you just telling me this now? And they go through a whole, they thought they were just Mexican. And you kind of go through reassess, who you are and your cultural identity, though, something you thought you were, something you weren't. It's not uncommon. We hear the stories where a family member, or somebody who just found out they were Native on like one of their parents' deathbeds, their parents basically dying, and they found out they were Native at that point, though. And then you have those that knew they were Native, but didn't know what tribe they were from, don't know anything about the culture, don't know anything about the community. And, and when they find that information out, they're going through, to some extent, an identity crisis of discovering who you are. I think one of the biggest factors, though, when you look at substance use in general, though, is in people that don't use, are what were the preventative factors that prevented them from using substances, though? And the biggest one, I go back to is community. Community and culture are huge factors, just having that there. When you don't have that, you're at a higher risk of using substances in general, though, especially if you don't have a cultural identity. And I think those are some of the big things that are out there in the community one of the biggest things that affect the community are those factors in general, though. Just knowing that information and knowing who you are when you don't have it. The other thing with you look at generational historical trauma is that, Native Americans weren't able to openly practice their culture until just over 50 years ago. And so there was a long period of time where some of the language was lost and some of the culture was lost. And this isn't all tribes, though, but I would say it does affect a large number of tribes, though, where they lost a lot of their identity in general. And so for a lot of them, it's having to rediscover, the tribes themselves having to rediscover who they are, redevelop the language for it. And then you're having to teach the language because, at this point, there's some tribes where there's this elder who's like 80, 90 years old, and they're the only person who grew up, really learned the language. And then they're teaching everybody else, including the other elders, the language. And they're trying to document that so that they have it, so they can revitalize their culture in general. Then you have some tribes as well where they, have experienced, a loss of a lot of culture in general. And they adopt, though, from other tribes as well. You mentioned drumming earlier. Well, not all tribes drum. They don't, and so, but you'll see a lot of those tribes, members still practicing drumming. And it's because they feel that it's cultural identity. They're adopting it as part of their culture, though. But that's not what their tribe traditionally did, though, or practice.
Makes a lot of sense. I do want to segue towards being able to go ahead and talk about treatment and trusted messengers. So we talked a lot about Western medicine, but traditional and cultural healing practices, do you feel are most vital to incorporating alongside those medications for opioid use disorders or MOUDs? And, just given that you've been working with this population, Cheyenne, I'm definitely curious what your thoughts are.
I feel like having those messengers is really important. Like, I know for myself, having worked at more like westernized medical substance abuse recovery places, we would offer, there was always the option for MAT services, but there was kind of like the overwhelming sense of like, kind of like that's not real sobriety. And when it came to cultural practices, it's kind of like, yeah, we can offer that. Like we'll cross that bridge when we get there instead of like trying to like actively learn. And so when I started working at BAIHP, it was kind of like scrapping what I had learned previously and trying to, okay, like this person relapsed, we don't have to kick them out of our program, type situation. So I feel like I've been able to see like how important not just like the getting this person sober is, but let's use all like everything that we have at hand. So like MAT services, MOUDs, things like that. And let's also incorporate the cultural practices as well too, because that's only going to help, right? Even if it's something as like simple as like, let's smudge before and after. So we can make sure that you're leaving on a good note instead of like having this like really heavy conversation and then like, okay, see you next week. It kind of wraps everything up nicely together.
I want to add to that as well, though. But even though, like Cheyenne mentioned, incorporating smudging, for example, you look at smudging, you look at song, you look at sweat, though, it's not just practicing it. It's also having somebody somebody from the community who can actually practice it and lead it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah,
it's
true.
Trying to word it properly, but like, if I say, hey, we want to do smudging, and then let's say, hey, how do you smudge? And I say, okay, well, this is how you smudge. And I kind of explain it. And there's no right or wrong way to smudge, in general. But I give you the basics and you say, hey, I can do that. It doesn't mean that you should be out there smudging, though. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Everybody, though, in a community or anybody in a talking circle, though. So it's encouraged that, if you want to smudge, we'll give you medicine. You want to practice it, then practice it. But it doesn't make you automatically certified, though, or approved to deliver it. I mean, you can, but it's who you are and the trust you have in the community and what you're representing is a big factor in it, though. It doesn't mean you should be afraid to practice it, though, to offer it. But where I'm getting at, though, is that make sure whoever's doing it is a trusted member of the community, though, and really stand by whatever they're practicing as well. And that goes to that goes to prayers, that goes to song, that goes to dance, because it's very personal for the community. And then another factor on top of that, though, is not just practicing the smudge, but where did you get your medicine? Because that plays a big factor in it as well. And people will ask you in the community, where did you get that medicine? When you sweat, who's doing the sweat? What kind of rocks are you using? What are you using on the rocks? What medicines are you burning? Who's going to be there? Who's going to be leading it? Those are all factors in community that that needs to come from somebody who the community trusts in general, because if your medicine's not right, they're going to tell you that's bad medicine. And they're not going to do it. They're not going to practice it. And then if you're having to explain, somebody's having to explain to you those practices as well, though, it's not, you're probably not really qualified to really be delivering it, though. So, and the community looks at things differently. Some community members will be like, well, you're trying, so it's a good thing, though. Doesn't mean they'll participate in it then. And then you have other members in the community as well that will look at it as like they shouldn't be doing it at all, though. And then if you do it, you need to make sure that you know what you're doing. You know why you're doing it. You know why you're using sage, or why you're using sweetgrass. You know the representation behind the medicines as well. And so you really didn't know fully what you're doing. Otherwise, the community is going to look at you in a different way. And to some extent, you are going to be judged for the way you are.
I think, again, programs need to be built in and with community. You can't come on in the end and, slap on a sweat and say that, this is a culturally informed practice. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It shouldn't be like, oh, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. If you're understanding that these are cultural practices important to the individual during assessment, they should be built in across treatment and figuring out who are those trusted providers in the community to help them access and reconnect with these practices in a way that's meaningful to them and not just, as a token. I think that it's really easy, again, it keeps coming back to trust, especially for folks who are on the outside, how easily that can be violated, and how important it is to be showing up, be honest, transparent, and saying what we don't know. So if folks are having to seek services in our community that, cannot be provided by BAHP because you guys cannot do every single service in the community yet, they've got to go to detox somewhere and it's not run by you guys. So then, how can we help folks, to trust to take that step forward? How can we know what are the limitations of some of those Western resources and set them up for success? Knowing they're going to have to reach out to other folks and preparing them for some of that work in those conversations. And the perception of judgment, right? I shouldn't have to explain why this thing is important to me or how I do it. It's not my job to educate you. And then it seems like that's the situation, though, people are put into time and again, because there is a lack of understanding of what do these practices mean, how do they promote wellness and healing. And I attended this really awesome webinar, which was indigenizing the 8 dimensions of wellness. And it blew my mind because, they had originally created the 8 dimensions, based on a very Western colonial view. And they said, well, you need to think about this in a different way because they're talking about financial wellness, which is like very based on a capitalistic society. And they said, well, when you're looking at this from an indigenous lens, right, like what that looks like is very different. And that you could be rich in other things, right? Like what were your relationships or what you're able to share with other people and not just, what does your bank account look like, which of course we'd all like for it to look great. But what were these other ways, of being connected? Even, when we're talking about occupational wellness, it was like, what are some of your roles in your community? And that's part of your occupation and how you show up with people. And it's not always connected to paid work. And how do we tap into that and really help people to conceptualize the life for themselves in a way that makes sense to them versus like as an outsider, well, this is how I've been trained to look at the world. So you need to meet me here.
Mm-hmm.
That's very well said. And I would say decolonizing the perception of, wellness in general and treatment and services is a big factor in keeping culture as the base. And when you look at recovery, it's usually evidence-based. You have some programs that are community-based, but culture comes first. It trumps mental health. It trumps medical services. It trumps everything in what we do. And that's the basis of what we build the services on. In fact, when you look at our medicine wheel, you'll see a staff on the medicine wheel, and there's 2 serpents. And it's basically where where Western medicine and traditional medicine meet at that point. And so in order to really achieve full wellness, you really have to treat the mental, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual aspect of a person to really achieve wellness and in some cases recovery.
Yeah, one of the very important things that we're taught as social workers is to ensure that we incorporate the biopsychosocial and most importantly, spiritual component of everything that we do, because all of that, it's holistic. It's all one. With that said, I am a big believer that the messenger matters. Who are the most effective voices in the community? Is it the elders, faith leaders, or perhaps peers who walk the path themselves? And whoever wants to take the lead on this.
Elders and I guess faith leaders, which I struggle with that word, with that term. I would say, traditional healers would probably be the more appropriate word to use on that. But I would say the elders and traditional healers are the biggest thing. And because even in the community itself, and let me step back a minute. I would say those who are considered elders and those considered especially traditional helpers, it's not you can just call anybody a traditional helper or a traditional healer. It's something that's really earned, because even if you see, let's say Cheyenne's out there smudging, Cheyenne's out there leading a talking circle, Cheyenne might be out there leading a sweat, it doesn't mean she's a traditional healer. It means she's trusted to lead these practices, though, but it doesn't make her a traditional healer. The people who are traditional healers in the community are considered those that are really strong and not just their faith, but they bring what they call strong medicine to it, though. And so there's a certain way the community views those, and people are very reluctant to want to even take that on. Even if they know all the information, even if they know the ways, some people refuse to be categorized like because they'll be like, I'm not living in that life right now, though. I know the information, I'm living well, but I'm not living to that level of standard, though. And so that's perception there. Elders, of course, as well. Elders bring, wealth of information, decades of knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation. And so elders are generally pretty part of the community that really meets. Elders are looked at in the community in general to really provide that insight in the community. As when we started re-engaging the community after, when I brought into the organization, we had several changes. And when we wanted to re-engage our community, really grow and expand the services that we were in the community, we focused on the elders. Dr. Hare mentioned, bingo size is what we use. And it was bringing the elders in for our falls reduction program, building that relationship with them. And they would then tell their kids and their grandchildren, hey, come into BAIHP, get services for whatever you need. It's okay. You can trust them because their approval goes a long way, and without their approval, the community is not going to show up.
Makes a lot of sense. Cheyenne, any thoughts there?
No, I totally agree. Even if I had I have a few of the women at our community members at work that trust me. That doesn't mean I'm like the world's best traditional healer. You know what I mean? I just, have some of the women that trust me. I think, and I think that is an important thing to understand. But yeah, I agree. Elders and traditional healers as well, for sure.
Yeah. Talking about the just genders, if one of the things that I'm definitely curious as a social worker and just understanding my culture, I like to talk about this a lot because in my culture, one of the areas that I believe can definitely be improved is the area of what we call machismo or masculinity, where it's a patriarchal structure. And I guess I'm curious from your perspective, are there gender biases or taboos or expectations in the Native community that make the journey to recovery look a little bit different for men versus women? And I can start with you, Cheyenne.
I feel this is very interesting, a very interesting topic to me too, because like with my tribe, we're a matriarchal tribe, and that's traditionally how it was, right? The women typically made the decisions, and then, you kind of go from there. But because of colonization and assimilating to Western culture, a lot of things do become like patriarchal, right? That's just kind of how things have worked out. And so I feel like it's going to be different for everyone. I have found, like in my experience, that a lot of treatment can be done co-ed, but then there are spaces specifically for men and then for women. And I have found that it is difficult for the clients that are transgender, non-binary, identify as two-spirit. It could be a little tricky in that sense. So like that's something I'm still researching quite a bit to figure out how can we incorporate that, even if, someone's trans, they could, or a trans woman, they could join like a women's circle. But then in my brain, I'm like, okay, well, how would the elders react to that? You know what I mean? It can be difficult. And I foresee that it may be something that's difficult. But I feel like we're getting to a place that is a lot more accepting. I have found in the more westernized places that I've worked that have had like trans clients, they've been very accepted, which has been great. But then there is still that weird, awkward space for those who are genderqueer, non-binary, and it's just, you're kind of not in one way or another, which honestly may just be fixed with like a 2S LGBTQIA group or something like that, right? So I feel like that's still a work in progress.
Johnny, any thoughts?
Yeah, just kind of back to what Cheyenne was saying, though, there are a lot of tribes that were matriarchal. And when colonialism, came about, there was a lot of confusion with the tribes because the women are the ones of power, though, the ones that were authority, the ones that spoke for the tribe, though. And it doesn't mean that they were the ones out there, hunting and gathering. They were just considered the leaders, though, because everybody had their own type of role that they delivered. And we still see that today. I would say majority of the elders that we have at the clinic that, that speak to the community are usually they're the aunties, the grandmas. They're the ones that are there, the main person of their family leading it. When you look at other practices and culture, though, in the community, you look at, let's say, drumming, for example. Drumming, we have drumming available, but it's just men that can drum. There are some women drum groups, but many of the cultures that we have from representing the tribes that drum, it's just the men are allowed to drum. Now, it doesn't mean we couldn't have women drum, but at the drum we have, because of those that lead it and how it's traditionally been run, it's just the men. If we had a woman that knew how to drum and knew the songs, we would allow the drumming to happen. And it's interesting, though, with some of the tribes, though, when it comes to drumming in general, though, is because there's different views on drumming, on where drumming originated from. Some of the drummers, when you drum, like especially when you come to our drum group, they sing at a higher pitch. Well, the reason when they sing at the higher pitch is because the men went off to war. And so the women had to teach the young boys to drum, to pass on the songs, because they were the ones that were able to drum. And so they sung at the high pitch because that's how the women sung at a higher pitch.
That was their registry, in a sense.
Yes. And so when you look at how they're singing, it's influenced by that, though. But however, the men can still only drum fourth then. And there's other things in the culture as well, though. Now, when it comes to like beating, when it comes to regalia making, those are open to any gender to practice it, though. But a lot of times it's not just being open on what gender can do. It's finding somebody in the community who can lead those traditional practices, who are willing to engage the community, though, to teach other members of the community those cultural practices in general. And I think that's where kind of the more struggle comes into, though, on us offering services, is having somebody willing to do it, though. That there's a lack of people with knowledge, though. It's just feeling somebody who feels that they're in the right place to be able to lead those activities that we have going on at the clinic.
I wanted to ask a question because I'm curious. You guys provided a really good context for understanding the importance of tribal elders and traditional healers as trusted sources of information. How do you think they go about sharing information? Whether it was about prevention, like here's something we need to be aware of, like you were saying, these risks, like here's some mental health concerns and how substance use could affect mental health, or whether it's that, hey, this is actually this is good medicine. Like we can trust Narcan or we could trust MOUD. How did those conversations happen? Is this like one-on-one? Is this at talking circles? Is this something where, having like community presentations at your facility because they trust you? How does this information get passed on?
I know for me specifically, if it comes up like during like a one-on-one session, then that's when I'll share it. Like, hey, these are some options. Like, do you have Narcan? Have you heard of Suboxone? Things like that. Then that's something. And these are things I'm sharing with clients that I know trust me and they call me for help and, things like that. So I know like for me, that's how I get that information out there. And I always offer, I'm like, if you want me to talk to your family, let me talk to your family. If you feel comfortable or if they want to pop in, like, let's have a discussion about it because maybe they don't know about it. Maybe they don't know that's an option because the first time they got sober was in the 2000s and Suboxone wasn't even a thing yet, So I just, try to give them little bits of information and knowledge throughout sessions,
So I think a lot of it is who the person is that's driving the initiative or supporting it, because trust is a huge factor. With our clinic and our CEO is well trusted by the board, and I've worked with them for over 6 years. I've been at the organization, and so I've built a level of trust with them as well. So they trust my boss, and they trust myself to drive some of the work that we're doing and some of the initiatives that we're pushing. They of course still have their biases or unconscious biases as well, on some of the work that we propose to do. And it's been able to justify it, though, and is having those conversations. But part of it is trusting our judgment and them actually willing to even ask, why we're doing it or ask questions. Because in some communities too, and sometimes it happens, if they don't trust the person who's driving the work, they can just say no. They don't need to ask why. They can just vote no, we're not going to do that. And so one of the conversations we had regarding our wellness vending machine when we were pushing it out, and my approach behind it, though, is that whenever a member of the community or even our board of directors, asks, aren't you enabling them? Aren't you enabling them to use these substances? You're equipping them with materials that's are going to enable them to have easy access and going to promote it. Like they come from the lens where you're promoting people to use substances. And at that point we say, no, we're not. I go, think about it. If a person's going to use, are they going to say they're not easily accessible supplies, I'm not going to use? Are they going to go out and find it? Well, they're probably going to go out and find it. I'm like, somebody who really wants to do something, they're going to do it regardless of what you say, regardless of what you do. I go, so what this machine does is it promotes wellness. So let's say a person comes in here and they get Narcan. Now they won't want the Narcan just in case they overdose. They might not need it for themselves. They might need it for a friend. They might need it for a family member. They might want it just in case. I go, but let's say they are using substances, and they are self-harm. When you open up the bag, and I give them the bag and they give them a kit, and they have these little cards inserts in them. And the cards have a list of supplies in there. And then on the other side, it talks about substance use in general. I go, so a person may come in here for the supply, but they're also going to leave with the card with resources on it. So when they're ready to find wellness, they know where to go. They know it's just a phone call away, or they're in a location they can access those supplies. I go, so people are going to use substances regardless of what you do or want, because it's a self decision to make, though. You can't cause somebody to behave differently than what they choose to behave. I go, but when they're ready to seek wellness, when they're ready to find wellness, we'll be just a phone call away.
Yeah. You guys are doing an amazing job with the wellness machines. I'm curious about how to address a lot of the practical issues, especially in the rural areas that affect a lot of the native population. How can we work towards solving the practical issues like transportation, lack of local providers in these rural areas that keep people from this care?
That's a loaded question.
You love my
Because I
loaded
feel like
questions, don't
that's what
you?
we're always trying to figure out. It's like, well, how can we solve the transportation issue in, the Kern River Valley area? Something that I think has been great and has been working is, uh, the community members up there getting into like healthcare, getting into mental health, and then turning around and helping their own communities. I have found that that's been very, very effective because they know the population up there. They know that this person doesn't like to be bothered, so let's not call them every week. They'll come to us when they're ready. That's as far as I've gotten with it so far because I've just seen that that's been effective, but I know that that's not realistic for a lot of people. Or, some people aren't into, the medical field, behavioral health field.
Yeah.
They're not able to um, afford school, things like that, So maybe putting more money into those low income communities would honestly be a big piece of the puzzle.
I think you guys have started. I mean, like you put a brick and mortar up that there's a space that people can go to access services and care that is run by you guys, not, a third party, never going to understand or pretend to understand the community and its needs. And that you understand that this is an employment opportunity for people, right? And then also when you're employing people from the community who know community members, this is going to help, again, to build trust in this area where you guys are your services are new to, you guys aren't new to. And that, like you're saying, the rural workforce expansion is critical, that you put up the machine so that there is a way for people to access resources, even if they don't want to talk or if people aren't available to talk. And I know you guys do telehealth. So I don't want to minimize, like you guys are very creative in trying to address the needs of the rural communities. And I think it's invaluable, for that you guys are in that space, and I hope you keep showing up in more spaces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I would say the biggest challenge, ultimately what it comes down to is funding. That's the number one thing it comes down to is being able to fund services, for offering rural services. Our clinic itself that was purchased in the Lake Isabella area was actually funded through funding for enhanced care management. And so right now the clinic only operates in offering enhanced care management services, or putting the wellness vending machine there to offer, supplies to the community there as well. I mean, eventually, as we acquire additional funding for staffing, we're going to expand the services offered there. So ECM kind of got us the clinic there to open the door to provide services, and we're building on that. To share a couple of things though. So for one, the Lake Isabella area though, which we call the Kern River Valley, Kern County Public Health Department actually conducted a community needs assessment. They did it in 2023. And in that report, they included the overdose death rates per zip code in Kern County. And the top 3 zip codes are in the Kern River Valley for overdose deaths. And so the greatest need in the county, even though there's a smaller population there, though, has the highest overdose death rates in Kern County. Now, with that, Kern County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services, they received the opioid settlement funds from, the pass-through from the state for the opioid settlements. And they did a community assessment throughout the county. And I attended the one that we did specifically for the Native population at Owens Valley Career Development Center in Lake Isabella. And one of the number one things that was mentioned is that there's just a lack of providers to be able to offer services, and that even when the locations that were offering those services there, they were very limited, and it could take them anywhere from a month and a half to be able to start receiving SUD service when they're ready. Now, when someone's ready to receive services, they're ready to see services at that moment. It's not next week, it's not later. If you don't get them in now, they may not come back though, And so with those factors in mind, though, is where we look at it from having the clinic there, though. If somebody came in for requesting services, and although this clinic primarily offers enhanced care management services, though, we still have telehealth services available in the community, and we could still send providers up to that location that only need a room to be able to meet with the community there. Now, we have that now. Then the additional thing beyond that, though, is that you also have to look at building the trust in the community. They know who we are. We built the trust down here, though. We have a lot of people membership from tribal communities from that area, though, that can, vouch for us, where you say, though. But the trust still needs to be built beyond that, though, because they need to say, okay, now you guys are here. What service are you providing? And so as the, clinic continues to exist, and as we continue to offer services and expand the services, it's going to grow the trust the community has in us, because they may come with us for ECM services. They may be okay with accessing the vending machine, but it doesn't mean that they're going to want to come in for substance use services yet. They want to see the work that we've done, and they're still looking at us and seeing what would be to offer there. And it's not just offering the services, it's the commitment behind it. Earlier in the podcast, Cheyenne had mentioned about contacting clients that haven't come in a while. One of the things I believe, Cheyenne, we're still doing, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're contacting clients that haven't come in a while. If it's been over a certain period of time, they call the clients just to wellness check-in.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, how are you doing? Is there anything that you need? And it's just making sure that they're continuing to live well, continuing that things are going well for them and they don't need anything. Because sometimes when people may come regularly for services, but when they really need something, they tend to shy away. They tend to seclude themselves from everybody else. So it's just kind of that wellness check-in, just to say, hey, we're here if you need anything from us. You know what I mean? Whatever you may be going through, though, or if you're just taking a break from the clinic, or if you just decided you don't need to come anymore, whatever it is, we're here for you.
And that just shows a lot of, as well, when you're building trust in that regard, that is being able to show that sense of consistency, that you are there, that you are present, that will ensure that the individual feels heard and valued, because most of the time they are isolated and secluded, especially in the Kern River Valley. They'll just kind of stay on themselves, kind of do their routine, and they may not necessarily feel that they are heard or valued. And that simple phone call could just do wonders.
Exactly. And you brought up something in your question too. You talked about transportation. So we know the internet signal is not the greatest out there. So even if you want to offer telehealth services to somebody who's living out that community, they may not have a phone, for one, though. And even if they have a phone, it doesn't mean they're going to have cell signal where they live. We actually provide transportation services at that clinic. So we'll actually go pick up our clients out, even here in Bakersfield. We'll pick them up. We'll take them to the clinic for services, and then we'll drop them back off after the services. So it's really about removing barrier. And as in some of our programs as well, we offer certain incentives for them as well. I know, and some of the services we have like gift cards that they can receive gift cards for participating in. And as we are able to find additional funding and acquire, we want to expand on those as well, though, because sometimes it's the incentive that draws them in just to see it. But if you're able to promote wellness with them, provide, education or, still some prevention and resiliency factors in them, then that's what we're shooting for as well.
The gift cards that releases the same level of endorphins as it would normally kind of using. Isn't that correct?
I mean, if like for contingency management approach, it would be, if they're intentionally testing negative for a substance and then getting the gift card as an incentive to continue the behavior, that's great. But, also, I think you guys are really responsive to social determinants of health, right? Like you have the food pantry, you understand transportation's a barrier. You understand that social connection's important, right? All these ways that you're seeing health as multidimensional versus just you're using or not using. There's all these things that need to come together to support somebody in their journey to wellness and recovery. And I think you guys see that so clearly, and that it's so central to how you engage people, how you retain them in care, and how you retain them in community, right? Because that's bigger than whether they wanted to get the healthcare service or not. You want them to be connected to you all and each other.
Absolutely. As we wrap up, if there's one key message or piece of advice that you would want to give to our listeners to take away about today's destigmatized mental health and addiction in the Native American community, what would it be?
I think I would just share that recovery is possible. If you haven't found a kind of, recovery method that works for you, there are so many. Like outside of like AANA, there's a ton of secular recovery at our organization. We do Red Road and Wellbriety, which is a Native American holistic recovery or type of way for recovery. And it's possible. And there's, if you're looking for that kind of help, it's everywhere. Or reach out to us and we'll navigate you somewhere.
I would say culture is medicine. Culture is prevention. And to our communities members out there, you are worthy.
For anyone that is interested in learning more about the Bakersfield American Indian Health Project, you could go ahead and visit their website at bakersfieldAIHP.org. You could go ahead and visit them at 501 40th Street in Bakersfield. Their number is 661-327-4030. And if you want more information on Hope in the Valley, you could go ahead and check them out as well at hopeinthevalleyca.org. Anything else that maybe I didn't ask that you may have wished that I would have asked in this episode?
Honestly, nothing that I could think of right offhand. I would just say maybe, what somebody can do to get started on the wellness vending machines if they were interested in establishing one at their clinic or organization, though. I would just defer them to reach out to Dr. Error here. Even though she might not serve all parts of the country, I know that she's willing to share her knowledge. She supported Tule River when they were looking at establishing their wellness vending machine as well with them. She gave them a wealth of information and insights and considerations for the machine. Lessons learned, a lot of it is in stocking and maintaining them as well, which they end up launching their machine. And I haven't checked in with them, but last I heard when they launched it, that it was well received by the community.
I think we hit a lot of topics that were important. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
To my awesome co-host, Dr. Herrera, any final thoughts before we conclude our episode?
I think keep talking to one another.
Mm.
You know, even if you can't share something with everyone, you're not ready for that yet. Find the trusted people in your life, you know, who are worthy of the type of disclosure, and know that you're not alone. Other people are struggling. And I can't say enough times that I saw, you know, really brave elders come up to me when Johnny let me table at some of their events, and they would share that my nephew died from an opioid overdose and would take the fentanyl test strips. It wasn't for themselves, but because their family had that incredibly painful loss, they know it's an issue for them. So the more that we talk about it, the more that we share messages, the more that we access resources and focus on wellness, you know, the more potential there is for recovery and not to lose another life.
Absolutely. And this was Hope in the Valley series episode 4. And I just thank you so much, Johnny, Cheyenne, Dr. Herrera. Truly value your time and your expertise and everything that you have done for the community and continue to do for the community. Thank you so much.